Overnight, £28 billion shares worth of trade deals were left in limbo. That was the price Britain paid for a single political decision. The shock came when Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi bluntly blocked a high-level British delegation, a shocking public affront to the kingdom that once dominated the world through its former colony. The silence that enveloped Westminster was a blow, not from war, but from two chilling words from New Delhi: visa cancellation. This political earthquake, shattering the uneasy calm, began after Labour leader Keir Starmer accused India of silencing dissent. Prime Minister Modi's retaliation was to ban the high-level British delegation. This was more than a diplomatic spat, it was a claim of sovereignty. For the first time in decades, Britain, a nation that once ruled vast swathes of territory, has been denied entry, an act that has replaced arrogance with cold, paralysing fear. The swift response has exposed the rot in Britain's post-Brexit strategy for a global Britain. Starmer's criticism, noble in London, sounded to Delhi like an echo of a century gone by. The patronising tone of the ghost of empire, the financial shocks have been devastating. The pound has plummeted, and analysts warn that £28 billion in bilateral deals, along with more than £12 billion in annual British exports, are now at serious risk. The crisis is not about principles, it's about the raw balance of power. India, with its $700 billion GDP advantage, has slammed the door on its former mentor. The refusal was not a misstep of diplomacy, it was a generational reckoning. "We will not be lectured by our former rulers," an Indian minister stated plainly, the words echoing not just across Delhi but through the forgotten corners of history Keir Starmer's call for virtue. Noble in the halls of Parliament landed in India as an imperial decree, a tone of entitlement that had persisted long after the official end of the Raj. This was the failure of moral diplomacy, an attempt by Britain to wield soft power through ethical judgment. Yet lacking the fundamental currency of respect, Delhi's response was a decisive shift from principle to power. The thunderous applause in the Indian Parliament was not a sign of mere defiance. It was the sound of a nation reclaiming its personhood and asserting its sovereignty. This deliberate action served as a profound healing of the collective memory, closing the chapter on centuries of systemic injustice. From the Bengal famine to the calculated extraction of wealth, India was not replacing Britain, it was outgrowing it. But the cost was immediate and deeply personal. While ministers in Westminster searched for blame, the economic crisis bit deeply into the fabric of British society. The threat to £28 billion in trade deals was soon reflected in soaring inflation and mounting social stress. This was the tragic separation between the political noise in the Commons and the grim reality on the streets. In a dim NHS break room in Manchester, a nurse stared at a medication invoice that had climbed another 7.4% overnight. She pressed her palm to her forehead and murmured, "My patients aren't numbers." A colleague placed a hand on her shoulder. No one spoke. As officials mouthed cliches about dialogue, citizens saw food banks overflowing and hospitals drowning. The economic fallout was the grim human consequence of political miscalculation, exposing the government's isolation from the suffering public. The crisis had moved beyond diplomacy. It had become a test of basic national competence and a challenge to the dignity of the British people themselves. The true gravity of the diplomatic fracture lay not in Delhi's defiant applause, but in the ensuing silence across Britain. In Birmingham, a retired veteran folded his faded Union Jack on the front steps of his housing block. "I carried this in Basra," he said quietly. "Now I fold it because no one respects it anymore. The camera didn't move, it didn't need to." Foreign papers called it the quietist collapse. The world had moved on. Westminster, tethered to the myth of past glory, had not. Its speeches now sounded like hollow echoes from a museum. This wasn't merely a political crisis, it was a profound societal disconnect. The final unravelling of national consensus, the pain of irrelevance. At the heart of the national trauma was the aching gap between generations. On social media, the young, fluent in the language of global independence, mocked empire nostalgia, treating the colonies as fictional history. Meanwhile, in care homes, veterans, The last living links to that past turned off the news, unable to reconcile the kingdom they fought for with the country waiting to be acknowledged. A retired officer in Birmingham captured the nation's descent into psychological crisis. We once ruled the waves, now we drown in self-doubt. This was the bitter truth. Britain's power wasn't conquered. It dissolved in indifference and self-pity. The byproduct of this collapse was the kingdom's swift slide into global irrelevance. As London searched desperately for an apology, Delhi was already redrawing the map of 21st century commerce India, bypassing its former coloniser entirely, announced a new digital trade corridor with Tokyo and Seoul. The world applauded the new partnership. London issued a statement history didn't notice. The irony was cruel. The empire that measured the world by longitude had lost its own direction. The Foreign Office, still clinging to maps coloured pink, whispered the damning prophecy. Britain's relevance is now ceremonial. The final cruelty of history is not lost, but being forgotten. The kingdom once obeyed, now waited for permission to speak. The political noise of Westminster, the endless debates without consequence, had been replaced by a heavy silence, confirming that Britain was no longer feared, but merely pitied. The silence that followed the new trade alliances was the final, definitive answer. While Britain argued over tone and searched for blame, Delhi was busy signing digital trade corridors with Tokyo and Seoul, forming partnerships without patrons. The new century had turned not with the bang of a war, but with the stark logic of choice. Nations once bound by British treaties were now writing their own. The Commonwealth, once a symbol of unity, now felt like a ghost of convenience. The fundamental shift was summarised best by an analyst in Washington. Britain still speaks fluent English. The world now speaks fluent independence. The end of a narrative. The painful truth was that India wasn't replacing Britain, it was outgrowing it. The empire that once controlled global trade routes now found its memory controlled by trade itself. Empires rarely end with an official surrender. They end with a quiet dissolution, the kind that follows when the world simply stops answering. This was the harsh generational exposure that Starmer's stumble had provided. A mirror held up to a country that no longer recognised its own reflection. Pride without reflection becomes parody. Leadership without humility becomes memory. The UK had not been dethroned by a foreign invader. It had simply outlasted itself. The lesson, delivered with brutal clarity by the rising East, was unforgiving. History respects those who adapt, not those who reminisce. Power had migrated, not stolen or seized, but abandoned by a political class too caught up in its own noise to notice the changing tide. The king remains. The flag still flies, but the meaning behind them has irrevocably thinned. If you followed this far, you already sense it. The century has changed hands. The sun didn't set on Britain, it simply forgot to rise. The silence that now hangs over Westminster is the silence that follows when the world stops answering. The painful truth delivered by Delhi's defiance is that Britain's power didn't die by conquest. It dissolved in indifference and the stubborn refusal to adapt. The flags still fly and the king remains. But the meaning behind them has irrevocably thinned. The kingdom that once drew the world's map has lost its own direction, caught between a nostalgic past and an unrecognisable future. This was more than a diplomatic bruise, it was a fracture in history. India, Brazil, Japan and the Gulf nations are forging new alliances, making the century's choice clear. To respect those who lead, not those who reminisce. History has delivered its verdict. Pride without reflection becomes parody. The century has changed hands. Are you prepared for the world that is rising in the East? Don't wait for permission to see the truth. Subscribe now to follow the shift in global power and understand the forces redrawing the map.